All right, we're ready for the third and final part of my presentation. And in fact, it took me a little longer to finish the first part than I thought, so we may not actually get through both topics that I wanted to cover today, but if any of you want to talk about my third topic later, we can. I want to talk about what I would call the increase in class warfare, or the rhetoric of class warfare that's around. There's a feeling that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. There's some rhetoric involved where there's some suspicion about the rich are getting rich at the expense of the poor. So I wanted to take a look at that both empirically, is it true, and also philosophically. If it is true, then how should we think about that? How should we evaluate that? So let's start with our empirical examination. First of all, to hear from a few different voices out there, Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor, says almost all the benefits of economic growth since the 1970s have gone to a small number of people at the very top. Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist and columnist for the New York Times, says we have seen levels of inequality today that have not been seen since the Gilded Age. Our political, business, and academic elites are waging an outright war on Americans, and I doubt that the middle class can survive the assault. That's Lou Dobbs, television personality and journalist, who wrote a book called War on the Middle Class. Well, this is kind of extreme rhetoric from Lou Dobbs and some strong assertions from those others. And what is the basis for these claims? Here is a graph which shows us the distribution of income, or the change, I should say, in income by group. So we have 5 groups here. The poorest group gained 6% of income over the period 1979 to 2004, whereas the top fifth gained 69%, 10 times as much. We see the top 1% gained an amazing 176% increase in after-tax income during the period. So you can see the benefits of our productive economy, the benefits of all the economic growth, at least by this graph, really have gone to a relatively small number of people. But I'm not sure that graph is giving us an accurate picture of what's really happened. So I want to take a look behind the numbers, and I just want to point out the graph, first of all, does not take into account transfers. And when you look at the tax burden over the last 20 years or so, you can see that the tax burden of the bottom 95% has actually been going down. The share of income taxes paid, as I think Tim Nash pointed out in his speech, the top 1% pay about 40% of the taxes on the income tax in this country, and that's up from about 25% back in 1986. So as a share of our federal tax revenue, the top 1% are paying about twice as much as what they used to 20 years ago. Now, we get confused because we look at tax rates instead of tax revenue. If we look at tax revenue, the picture does look a little bit different. And when we look at transfers, the picture looks more different still. Now, I haven't vetted these numbers. I'm not sure, but these were published in a newspaper called the Cleveland Current. And the author did some research taking into account the various welfare benefits and other tax effects in various places. And I think this was done for the state of Mississippi, a hypothetical person making $3,000, another one making $14,000, $30,000, $60,000 in the state of Mississippi. I'm not sure the year here, mid-2000s. You look at what they pay the government, and you look at what they're eligible for to claim in terms of benefits from the government. And if you make the additional assumption that they're going to buy health insurance, you can see that the value of of their income changes substantially. And so, for example, the range of over $50,000 in gross income becomes a very limited range of only $3,000 in terms of their actual purchasing power. And the purchasing power of the bottom group rises substantially because of a number of programs. You can see here Medicaid and Children's Health Insurance Program, another federal program for health care, temporary assistance for needy families. And they're eligible for a bunch of these benefits. At $14,500, income goes up, but eligibility for the welfare programs goes down. And so there's a little bump there. But as you improve from $14,000 to $30,000, you can see you lose a lot of the benefits. And in fact, this may be the reason why the guy who won the lottery was still allowed to collect food stamps afterwards, because the federal program suggests that, you know, we're not going to count your assets because we don't want to discourage you from accumulating assets. If we discourage you from earning income or accumulating assets, if we take away your benefits by $1 for every dollar you accumulate, then you're not going to be thrifty. You're not going to be... now, in the case of the lottery winner, this was a clear violation of the spirit of that law. It's actually used to encourage savings. This is a digression, obviously, but I know a case of a woman who in the 1960s on AFDC, a welfare program for women with dependent children, she had managed to accumulate savings of $10,000 over a period of 5 years. She made the mistake of reporting that to her caseworker. Unfortunately, the caseworker said, "You've got $10,000 in the bank? Uh-oh. Now you are no longer eligible for the program." That woman goes home, tells her neighbors, "If you got something in the bank, spend it quick." Okay? Or hide it. So in order to discourage these kinds of counterproductive incentives, you know, these transfer payments have been designed and reformed over the years to try and encourage people to be thrifty, encourage people to be hardworking. It doesn't always work out that way. All right, so once we take taxes and transfers into account, the numbers are going to change quite a bit. Another thing that the official numbers don't take into account is the change in the identity of the people. When you look at incomes in 1985 and you take the top 20%, that's not the same people that are in the top 20% in the year 2005. The identities of the individuals change. So looking at what's in a particular quintile or cohort, looking at that does not tell us what's been actually happening to those individuals' income over the period. Here's an example. Let's suppose we're comparing the growth in income from 1990 to the year 2000 in an economy with two individuals. Annie's got $10, Bill has $20. You can see Bill's got 2/3 of the income. Annie has $20 in the year 2000, Bill has $30. Okay? Should we count the change in their income? In this case, Annie's income grew by 50%. Bill's income grew by, by 100%, and Bill's income grew by 50%. Now, in this case, we want to include income of other people in their households. Should we do that as well? That might tell us what's happening if Bill gets married, if he has kids, if his kids go to work, if Annie gets married, etc. And each one of these is going to produce a different level of income, a different level of equality. Here's another way we could do it. We could just take an example of a poor family in 1990 and compare it to a different poor family in the year 2000. Which method should we use to measure changes in income over the period? Individual, household, or different households? They're going to give us different numbers, right? So the choice that we make is going to affect the numbers that we get. Therefore, I want you to be aware of what numbers are actually out there. And when you see a quote like the one from Robert Reich saying, "The rich have gained practically all of the income, well, I'm not sure that's true. They're using this last method to determine income gains throughout the period. I think this is a particularly poor choice of the three. I think the other two are more accurate. Here's an example. Let's suppose we were to look at individual income and keep track of that over time for a group of individuals listed here. And we've got 6 of them, and you can see their income in the first period we examine. And if you were to look at changes in their income over time, the poor are getting richer and the rich are getting poorer. So if you look at this, Flavius, who was a child in period 1, has grown up and taken a job. He's much richer than he used to be. Right? Amy is richer than she used to be. Bill is richer than he used to be. Ed's income has gone down. Now that's if we look at it according to individuals. But let's just introduce perhaps one change in this. Let's suppose that Kathy and Ed get married. Here's what happens to our quintiles. Because Kathy and Ed form one household, we see that the upper quintile is now gained 74%. These are the same numbers you were looking at a moment ago. Just to refresh your memory. Does it look like the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer? Does this look like the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer? You cannot get more diametrically opposed results. And the only thing we introduced to this was a marriage. Now, if in fact this does really reflect to a certain extent what's going on in household formations throughout the income distribution, then this is a serious flaw in the official statistics. If, for example, people in the upper half of the income distribution tend to get married more often than people in the lower half, which turns out to be true, then the very fact that those people are getting married makes it look like they're getting richer, even if, in fact, there's been no change in the income distribution whatsoever. So household formation plays a significant role. And here's one way you can tell why it's important. At an individual household level, the median income has been relatively stagnant over the last 30 years or so. And you can see that it's risen a little bit, but not very much. But what if we were to look at each separate individual using that first method that we talked about earlier? Then here's what's happened to the median income. And you can see a much more substantial rise. So one of the reasons why this inequality is showing up is precisely because households today are much different than households 30, 40 years ago. And in this case, we have many more single households, fewer married households. Those married households that we do have are concentrated in the upper half of the income distribution. Those households have much higher rates of marriage. Now, I don't know which is the chicken and which is the egg here. Are they in the upper end of the income distribution because they have a stable marriage? Or does their additional income help them to maintain a stable marriage? I'm not sure. I'm not qualified to comment on that. But in the bottom half of the income distribution, there's many more single households. Not only are there many more single households, but in terms of the household itself, how many people are holding a job? Or what about the children? Are they working? And you can see that in the top quintile, if we look at a number of categories here, they have much more two-income households. You'd think it's the opposite, right? That if you got a major breadwinner earning a lot of money, that the wife can afford to stay home, like Mitt Romney's wife. She's never worked a day in her life, some people say. But the fact is, no. Most of these households are characterized by two income earners, 12.6% in the bottom quintile. You can see 40% of the people in the bottom quintile have no people working. And when you look at the average number of earners in each household, it's more than 2 in the top quintile and less than 1 in the bottom. And that, when you look at full-time jobs, they're more than twice as likely to be working full-time in the upper quintile. Now, is this because they can't find a job? Is it because they don't want to find a job? Again, these numbers don't tell us what that might be. Another significant factor is the age of households. The age of households make a difference, obviously, because if you're retired, you're not actively earning income. You're living off your assets and your previously accumulated wealth. And we can see that in this case, there are a lot more retirees in the bottom quintile. They're not actively earning income. Okay? So much more youth in the bottom quintile as well. So age makes a huge difference. When we start to break it down by the individual characteristics that are kind of hidden when we aggregate it to the level of the household, we see there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. What if we had a statistician who was willing to take all of these into account, break it down into an individual basis, and imagine for a moment that household formation was the same today as it was back in 1970, that people married at the same rate, that they worked at the same rate, that they behaved in a way that was similar to the previous generation. And here's what the income distribution would look like. At the bottom, instead of falling, it would rise dramatically. Now, it would rise at the top, too. And it would still rise relatively quickly at the top. But we are not looking at the poor getting poorer here. We're looking at all income groups getting richer. Now, the other thing that's not captured, when we look at different people at the two periods, instead of looking at the same person over time, we lose a measure of mobility. And when we examine mobility, we get a different picture. When we look at the same people across time, we find that more than half of taxpayers moved. They weren't in the same group 10 years later. Where did they move? Well, if you began in the bottom quintile in 1996, you had moved up. Most of you, more than 50%. If you were among the richest, chances are good that you had moved down. Only 25% of, you've heard this 99%, 1%. Well, the 1% is constantly changing. The 1% in 1996, 25% of them had dropped by the year 2005. So the 1% are not the same group over time. The degree of mobility among income groups hasn't changed from the previous 10 years. There's not been a decrease in mobility. We see the same level of movement from quintile to quintile. And after adjusting for inflation, we see again that when you look at the same person over time, the average gain in income throughout that 10-year period, throughout the decade, was 24%. So when you look at individuals, we see a much different idea. It's not stagnation. It's growth. And that's the average rate of growth. How many people actually belong to that group? Well, 2/3 of the people in an individual study did experience some gains in income over the period. Okay. Here's another way of looking at the same story, and this gives a better picture. If you're in the lowest quintile group, how many of you had higher income at the end of the period? And if you're in the lowest group, 90.5% of those individuals reported higher income at the 10 years later. And if you're in the top 10%, only 2.9% of those people reported higher income 10 years later. So as a percentage of each group, a higher percentage of the poor groups were moving up than of the upper groups. We talked about the bourgeois value of having your children be better off than you are. And some people are worried that, well, your children are worse off. But the data doesn't reflect that. If you look at what's been happening to generations, children who report a higher income than their parents after inflation. And 67%, 2/3 of children report a higher income than their parents at the same age. And if you're in the top quintile, 43% of the children are doing better than their parents. But if you're in the bottom quintile, If your parents were in the bottom quintile, 82% of those children are doing better. So the children of that group are doing better than their parents did. And here's another way of looking at the same data. You can see the income scaled for each group, each quintile, and you can see that it's become larger all the way across. Every group has gained. 18% in the bottom quintile. This is the percentage of the children compared to the parents. So the parents of the children is 18% higher, 22% higher, 29%, 35%, and 52%. All right. So, you know what? I'm going to skip through some of these slides in the interest of time. But I also want to take a quick break here. Are there any questions about any of the points I made about the measurement? Okay. However, you may have noticed that even after making the proper adjustments for the numbers to show that there is a substantial amount of upward mobility, in spite of that, it is true that there's been increasing inequality. No matter how you slice the numbers, the gap between the highest income and the lowest income is increasing substantially. So what should we make of that? Is there an injustice here? Is there a role for government policy to make it more fair, redistribute, etc.? Two of the famous answers to that question are by two philosophers, Nozick and Rawls, who focused on different things. Obviously, as it indicates in the slide, Nozick was worried about the process. Is the process just? And Rawls was more worried about the outcome. Is the outcome just? I also want to talk about Friedrich Hayek, who was a professional economist, but very philosophical in his thinking. And his concern is not about the results at a moment in time. It's not about the process at a moment in time. What he's concerned about is more of a utilitarian argument. How does the distribution of income affect the progress of civilization? So we're going to talk about all three of these viewpoints. First of all, with Robert Nozick. He argued that if you're going to have a just distribution of income, you need to satisfy these three conditions. If you got it, whatever it is, if you got it fairly, if there was no injustice in the way you obtained it, you didn't steal it, didn't use fraud, if there was justice in transfer, in other words, somebody else made it, but you acquired it by exchange, or maybe they gave it to you as a gift. There's no injustice when my son, who's poorer than I am, gave a nice gift to his mother for Mother's Day, right? There's no injustice there. The fact that his mother is wealthier than he is, there's no injustice involved in a gift. And if there's nothing you have which violates those two conditions, then he says what you have is justly yours. All right. Now we need to distinguish between what Rawls is going to emphasize, which is a kind of equality under the process, equality under the law. If we're all treated the same in terms of the process, we will very likely have different outcomes. We'll have different holdings. And that's nothing to be concerned about because people themselves are different by nature. Free people are not equal. And if you see equality to the extent that you see it, there's a good chance that there's a lack of liberty. Right? If you see a country you're visiting, everybody is dressed the same and lives in the same kind of house, you can be fairly certain you are living in an oppressive country. If people are listening to the same kind of music, it doesn't matter what metric you want to use. If there's an extreme level of equality beyond that which exists in human nature, then we're talking about a lack of liberty. Okay? Now, if you have a country which treats people the same under the law, then you're going to see all kinds of variation in houses. You're going to see all kinds of variation in clothing, in music, in the way they spend their leisure time, and so forth. The things they study, the books they read. That's nothing to be concerned about or ashamed of. On the other hand, John Rawls said we do need to be concerned about outcomes. We do need to be concerned when we see a wide difference in what people are consuming and what they have and so forth. And he emphasizes the fact that what we really need is equality of prospects. Somebody who's born to a poor family in a bad neighborhood simply doesn't have the same prospects of success than somebody born to a good family in a good neighborhood. Maybe as a matter of social justice, we need to help that kid attain a higher level of success to overcome his social disadvantages, which really are not his responsibility. Give you an example of maybe something Rawls might have in mind. I'm always concerned about the fact that the people who clean our bathrooms are so badly paid. I always thought that if you do something like that, a repugnant task, you ought to earn a wage premium. You ought to earn some kind of medal, in my opinion, for doing that. And yet those people are often among the least respected and the lowest paid members of our society, even though they're doing these tasks that we need to have done, and most of us wouldn't do. So why shouldn't we do something to make their life a little more pleasant, their prospects a little better, so that if there were fewer people willing to do that because they had other better opportunities, then the wages of those that remain would go up, and maybe that's what we ought to do. But in this case, we're up against a capitalist rule. In capitalism, you don't get paid on how hard your work is or how unpleasant it is. You get paid at the end of the day by the results. How much value do people place on the work that you did? Are you willing to do it at this wage instead of that wage? So you can't have capitalism and redistribution, at least not in its pure form, at the same time. What Rawls suggested is if we could get together in a room and forget about the world and our position in the world, forget about where you were born, what your credentials are, what your prospects are, get together with a bunch of other people, and as far as you know, you could be the least lucky person in that room. But while you're in that room, you really don't know. And you have a chance to talk with your colleagues there and say, when we leave this room, some of us are going to go back into the world and we're going to be janitors cleaning toilets for $8 an hour. What would you do? Rawls suggests that under those circumstances, you would reach a binding contract with one another. You would say to each other, well, gosh, if I'm the one who ends up in that position, I would hope that you guys would send a little cash my way to make my life more pleasant. And if you agree to do that, then I will agree, if perhaps I'm the one that's lucky enough to have a better job, that I will send a little cash your way. And if we can make this binding contract before we leave the room, then we would agree to redistribute income. And Rawls says if we reflect on that as individuals, most of us would agree that that's what we would do. And somehow he comes up with the idea then that this really is an implicit social contract. The only reason we don't have such a social contract is because we're already born into the world. We already know that we're lucky. And therefore the lucky people will not agree to share with the unlucky people. If you know, for example, that you were born into a well-educated household where your parents are very concerned about getting you into the right schools and encouraging you to get a good education and so forth, if you already know all those things about yourself, then even though you were lucky in that respect, you're going to act as if you earned that. And you say, hey, no, that's mine. I'm not going to help you. You should have made something out of yourself. So that's Rawls' argument, that because we're born in the world, we can't reach a social contract that most of us would consider to be just in a hypothetical case. To go into a little bit more detail, Rawls has two conditions that he says a social contract must meet. Obviously, he values freedom, or he makes his argument from an individual rights perspective. He wants everybody to have a certain amount of freedom. He doesn't want to take people's income arbitrarily. But the second one is the controversial point. Inequality in prospects is permitted only if all benefit from it. In other words, we can have inequality if it raises the income of everybody in the group. But no other inequality will be tolerated. Let's take as an example this hypothetical case. There is a society in which every individual in that group is going to have $50. And in its original position, that is, it's in this room, it doesn't know what they will do or what they will be when they leave the room. Everybody is ignorant of their circumstances. And they're told, you know what, if we allow a little bit of inequality, if we change our rules, if we change our institutions that allow some of us to be more entrepreneurial, for example, and then they can hire the rest of us, and the rich guy, the entrepreneur, will make $80, will make $80, but the rest of us will make $60 as a result. Would we agree to that? Will we allow that much inequality? And Rawls says, yes, that will be part of the social. Who wouldn't agree to that? Everybody's better off. And they'll tolerate inequality as long as everybody benefits from that inequality. And so with respect to incentive effects, he says, we need a certain amount of inequality to create incentives, but we should only tolerate as much inequality as is necessary to preserve the incentive. All right. Well, Rawls' theory has been very influential. Let's take a look at some of the counter-arguments. First of all, Rawls is acting as if we're given a set of numbers to choose from. In the previous example, he's saying, let's choose a set of rules that will produce these results. In the real world, you cannot see what results will follow from a particular set of rules. In other words, even if you could somehow give people temporary amnesia, you have no opportunity to make any set of rules on the basis of that. Second criticism, not everybody is risk averse. Not everybody sees the meaning of life as how do we divide up the goods. A lot of people see more to life than that. Life is a challenge. Life is an art. Life is something to be lived for the fun of it. And in that case, you might be willing to take a certain amount of risk. There's a reason why people play poker, right? Everybody plays poker. Some leave richer, some leave the game poorer, but people enjoy playing the game. They enjoy the thrill, I guess, of using their talents, using their judgment in order to come home with a bigger share. Another criticism of Rawls concerns non-material goods. Rawls is very materialistic in the way he looks at outcomes. He only includes income as a comparison in that previous example. But the fact that there's a lot of other things besides the material goods in life. If we want equality, we're so concerned about it, then we have to consider other goods as well. What about beauty? Right? Why is it that some girls get all the guys, at least the attention? Is that fair? If we could have a social contract, shouldn't we handicap beauty in some way? Shouldn't we say to Marilyn Monroe, well, couldn't you put on 50 pounds just to be fair? In order to equalize prospects, wouldn't you have to go beyond pure wealth and examine other assets that give people an advantage? And then finally, the incentive problem. It goes beyond what Rawls understood. The influence of such a policy on incentives will be much more extensive, I think, than Rawls gives it credit for. For one thing, the amount of learning that would take place. When there's real risk involved, you learn from your mistakes, you are rewarded and reinforced for your success and your achievement. And I think there's much more learning involved when there's much more at stake in the game. Obviously, work depends on differences in reward, will produce differences in effort. Enterprise, again, why take a risk if the outcome is not going to be substantially different? And thrift, why be thrifty if your savings simply means that you are going to give more to others? So I think it's an extensive incentive problem that we're dealing with. These are all potential criticisms of Rawls. I want to move on to Hayek now. Hayek is more concerned about progress over time of civilization as a whole. Will each generation be better off in some respects than the previous generation? And he says that even though Rawls suggests that there's a lot of luck involved in our outcomes, there is a kid who was born to wealthy parents, perhaps, and that kid does have an advantage. But even though that kid, his outcome's affected by luck, we should still give him responsibility for what he does with that opportunity, because it will change him as a person. If we take away that responsibility and say, well, you were born into a good household, so we're going to automatically limit the growth of your income. Or you were born into a poor household, so we're going to automatically raise the level of your income. Hayek says, you take away that responsibility for the outcome, you change the life of that person. You change who they are, literally, their personality. Here's a good example. I'm going to go through it quickly. As I said during the data and the inspection of the data, marriage rates in the lower half of the income distribution have fallen off dramatically since the 1960s. And one of the reasons why marriage rates have fallen off so much among that group might have something to do with public policy during the period. In 1960, if you were a poor person, and let's suppose we have a couple of teenagers. This example is from Losing Ground by Charles Murray. A couple of teenagers, the girlfriend gets pregnant, and now these are the economic choices they face. In that time, there was a certain amount of social pressure to get married, so I've included that as one of their options. They could get married or not. Now, if they do get married, Harold, in the standard of the time, would probably be obligated to support his wife and child, go out and get a job. If he doesn't get a job, they have no means of support. So these are the incentives facing the couple in the 1960s. 1970, these are the way that public policy has changed the incentive. What do you observe here? There's really only one outcome which is superior to the rest, and that's to stay unmarried with Harold working. On the other hand, from Harold's perspective, is it really that superior? What happens if Harold decides he's not going to work and he's not going to get married? Is his family going to lose all means of support? No. His family will get $134, even if he's entirely gone from the picture. Changes the whole morality of his decision from his own perspective. Changes the way we look at it. First of all, even Harold and Phyllis are both going to look at this marriage as a bad strategy. And it means Harold, without the benefit of marriage, is less likely to take an interest in the life of that child as they reach adult years. So what's happened because of these incentives is, you see, the number of single-parent households has increased dramatically. This particular slide breaks it up between black and white. You can see in the black community, in 1940, the rate of single-parent households was less than 15%. But by the year 1996, that had risen to about 70%. This has had devastating consequences for urban communities. But the same thing is true, you see it in white families as well. So incentive effects are important. You change the policy, you start to change the way people obtain income and the consequences of their behavior. They will adjust their behavior over time, at least to a certain extent, to the incentives that you create. Can we somehow overcome the incentive problem? Let's imagine how we might do it. What if we based pay on effort? We just paid you based on effort. Somebody works really hard cleaning that toilet, and another person works really hard preparing a PowerPoint presentation for a conference. They both put in the same amount of time. They should both get the same pay. And if they don't work, they don't get it. So in a way, there's an incentive to work there, right? But I want to use the example of Michael Jordan to say that, in fact, this is not going to generate what we truly want. Michael Jordan put a lot of effort into developing his skill as a basketball player, and a lot of people paid millions of dollars in total to watch him play. But he also put a lot of effort into becoming a baseball player. Now, if we base his pay on effort, we'll pay him the same amount whether he plays baseball or basketball. What's the problem there? Yeah, we don't want him to play baseball. He's really not that good. We don't pay him to play baseball because, frankly, his talent isn't that special. It's not that useful to us. We don't get excited about it the same way when he plays basketball. If we base pay on effort, then people will not get the message about what is their true vocation. What do people really want from them? What if we reward people not for the results, but for something else? Because you can't always control results, right? You might make the same effort in your business model. Because you start your business during a recession, it fails. Somebody else has a weaker business model, and yet because they start up during a boom, they can afford to make mistakes, and they learn from those mistakes and are ultimately successful. Well, it doesn't seem fair. Life isn't fair. Turns out that tall men make more money than short men. Now, if you're tall, you're probably thinking, what's so bad about that? If you're short, this may cause some envy, resentment. You know, it doesn't stop at money, gentlemen. It also has a lot of impact on your relationships. So there's actually an economist who has written an article published in a major academic journal suggesting that one of the most efficient ways to redistribute income would be to put a tax according to height, and that the people who are taller would pay a certain additional tax rate based on the number of inches they are over the median, and people who are less than the median would pay a lower tax rate. According to Rawls' system, this would be fair, equal prospects, right? A guy who's born tall has an advantage, just like Marilyn Monroe, born beautiful, has an advantage. Well, we should put a tax on beauty. We should put a tax on height. We should put a tax on all those things that give people a natural advantage. What does Hayek say about this? Well, let me move. Hayek argues that progress comes when people exploit their advantages. No matter where those advantages come from, no matter where those opportunities are, we as a society benefit when we have a rule of law, when we are able to justly interact with one another in terms of no theft, no fraud, and so forth. When we have advantages, we tend to use those advantages often in ways that benefit society as a whole. We don't know exactly how people will use their advantage in height or intelligence or in the way they were parented. We just don't know what use they will make of those advantages. Somebody who inherits $1 million, we don't know what they will do because they had $1 million more than other people. Yesterday we had somebody here, I'm not sure you know her, Patricia Nagley, who gave $10 million to Northwood University to benefit the students of Northwood. And she had $10 million extra to spend. Every single building on campus at Northwood University was donated by somebody who had more money than they needed. I say, great. The fact is, some people do have more money than they need. And some people, because they have more money than they need, will look around and find useful ways to take advantage of that situation. Okay? Since we don't know in advance, and no economic planner can know in advance what use will be made of these advantages, Hayek says, simply leave them in place. There's a good chance that the individual who has the advantage will figure out some socially productive use to make of them. That's human nature. People want to do something. They want to do something meaningful with their lives. And if they have a particular talent, if they have a particular level of intelligence or a particular opportunity, they'll make something of it, more often than not. Take a look at some of these advantages that some people have. Children inherit a family culture. Children inherit a certain genetic capacity for strength or intelligence. They inherit a certain amount of money. So what? Well, it's not fair. Right? Child didn't deserve these advantages. Well, Hayek points out that these advantages that derive from belonging to one family and not another are a natural consequence of a society which gives parents responsibility for their children. If you don't like a society where parents give responsibility to their children, if you have some other way of raising children, then you might be able to eliminate these unfair advantages. But as long as we're going to rely on families to raise children, you're going to have these inequalities. How else are you going to do it? There are a number of alternatives that have been proposed, some serious, some fictional. You may be familiar with the book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, in which the family is systematically eliminated from its natural role in society. We could, I suppose, raise people. We're really getting to that point where this is no longer science fiction. And if we want to raise people in a different way, give them certain advantages, talents, we want to eliminate those that are disadvantaged by some kind of genetic screening, we could do that. Hayek says, don't do that. Okay? Let these natural inequalities emerge. This is going to be the source of progress. Okay? In fact, he says the argument for freedom is based on little else. These little experiments that each of us do with the advantages that have been given only to us. Sometimes the advantage is simply being in a certain place at a certain time. Give you an example. Billy Durant, the founder of General Motors, was on a certain street in Flint on a certain day when he hitched a ride from a friend of his. And he got in the horse, in this case a horse-drawn carriage, and felt over the brick streets of Flint a smooth ride, smoother than he'd ever experienced. And he was so intrigued by this, he actually asked his friend where he got the carriage. And he got off the carriage and hopped over to the carriage factory, which was in another part of town. And he asked the owner, he said, how did you make that ride so smooth? He inspected the suspension. And because Billy Durant, who was a teenage cigar salesman at the time, he had been traveling around selling cigars, he knew there was a buggy show in Wisconsin. And he decided on the spot, you know what, I'm going to buy this company, and I'm going to take this carriage to the show, and I'm going to sell hundreds of these. And that's exactly what he did. And his company became one of the leading carriage manufacturers in the United States, and it formed the initial business which he later sold off and used the capital to purchase General Motors when he saw the transition to automobiles. He bought Buick, actually, and started General Motors based on Buick. The point is, Billy Durant was simply in the right place at the right time. But you never know. Somebody else in that exact same place at that exact same time would not have done anything like that. We need those unique individuals with their willingness to experiment, to exploit their advantages, if we as a society are going to advance. That is the meaning of freedom, at least in Hayek's view. A good example of how we benefit from these developments, you can see how certain goods were only obtainable to a select few. The John D. Rockefellers, the Andrew Carnegies, the Cornelius Vanderbilts, the robber barons, the incredibly wealthy individuals. And those goods, which were available to them, made them a source of envy, I suppose, to most of the people of their day which could not have those goods. But what happens? If they can afford to pay for some of these things in the initial stages of development, then it rewards entrepreneurs for developing these things in the first place. If I have a market for an air conditioner, then I can experiment with air conditioning. I can attract investment. I can make a loss for a few years, selling to a very limited market. But I can survive then. And when I develop more efficient ways of producing air conditioners, I can find ways of lowering the price and expanding my market. I can make more money by mass producing it. And eventually it becomes something that is enjoyed even by the lowest members of the economic class. And so you can see here the level of ownership of certain things that used to be considered luxuries. Refrigerators. Now nearly 100% of us own refrigerators, televisions, stove, and so forth. You can see the list here. These things are all introduced as luxuries available only to certain people who had the advantage of having a little more money, sometimes a lot more money. Here's what I'm going to say. To summarize Hayek's argument at least, and I think the gist of where I'm going with this, if you want good results, then you've got to reward results. If you want good results, you have to reward results. It's simply a matter of giving people responsibility for results. That's ultimately what's going to generate the kind of results you want. And that's where I'm going to leave you today. I know that I didn't give you a chance for questions, so what I'm going to do is perhaps at the end of the day, no, not at the end of the day, well, I'll make an announcement about what we're going to do as far as Q&A. I do want to include a little time for Q&A, and we'll do that perhaps after lunch, okay? And I'll let you know how that will change our schedule. So thank you very much.